from first getting COVID. And we know that's the first step in preventing them from getting really sick from COVID. If we can prevent them from getting COVID in the first place, that means that they're not going to be at risk of getting a severe reaction to COVID if they get it, to get hospitalized, or to get that rare inflammatory disease that I mentioned.
So you mentioned that Miss C, I can't pronounce it,
That's
but
right.
you know,
Miss
we
C.
know there's measles, mumps, rubella, smallpox, chickenpox. These are dangerous diseases for children. COVID, yes, you mentioned there have been some extreme cases, but in the Wall Street Journal this week, 2 physicians, one from Sloan Kettering, one from Cornell Medical School, reported of the 28 million children between 5 and 11 in America, 94 have died, 562 have been hospitalized out of 28 million. I'm not good at math, but that's a very, very tiny, tiny, tiny percentage. So with that as the pretense, why is this an emergency that children should get vaccinated now and not wait a few years for more research?
I think this is a great question because we want to remind folks that even though the risk of hospitalization and death are rare in children, as well as this inflammatory condition, it is possible. And now we have a safe tool to protect our children. I'd equated, and I want to have Dr. Wong weigh in too, right, that we all, for example, use car seats or seatbelts with our kids. Even though the risk of dying in a car accident is pretty rare for a kid, which is great. But we want to do everything we can as parents to protect our kids. And so I see the vaccine, because it is safe, as one of those really effective tools to protect our kids. Let me turn it over to Dr. Wong to add more.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, importantly, any preventable hospitalization or preventable death in a child is very worth it. To also put it into context, it is a small number. Fortunately, we don't have that many children who die each year, but in 1 year with COVID-19, it has become it's been in the top 10 list now of the things that are killing our younger children. And again, every death of a child that we could have prevented is a true tragedy. I will also just say, as Dr. Cohen was mentioning, we have lots of kids who are getting really ill, over 50,000 in the country, who have not needed to go into the hospital. Fortunately, many of those children, we're able to give them treatment, support them, and have them come out. But certainly we don't want any child to go into the hospital, and the family who is, having to deal with that stress going into the hospital if they don't need to, because we have this safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine.
For young, I think in the tweens, we knew about some cases of myocarditis in young males in particular. What do we know about that as a side effect in these trials? And here in North Carolina, do we have any cases of that in so far those immunizations?
Sure. Let me turn it over to Dr. Wong again. Thanks.
So in the clinical trials, we didn't see any of those myocarditis cases in the children ages 5 to 11. There are a couple of reasons we think that's the case. So number one, the dose of the vaccine for our 5 to 11-year-olds, it is smaller. And it's smaller meaning that they're going to have, less, in part because we didn't want them to have so many of those temporary reactions, but still wanting to make sure that it's effective. Fortunately for us, our younger children have very robust or strong immune systems, so when we give them a vaccine, even better than adults, they are able to really mount that robust protection or immune response that we're looking for. And so because we knew that they had that more robust immune response, we were able to bring that dose down, which also meant that we would see less of these other temporary reactions or more serious side effects like myocarditis. In addition, the myocarditis syndrome we know happens more often, not just with COVID, but myocarditis happens from other viruses too. This is something that we see as a practicing pediatrician. Sometimes we see kids get myocarditis or its cousin pericarditis when kids get other viruses too. We know that we see this more often in general in our older teens because some of that has to do with the hormones and puberty and sort of how that affects the way that their bodies react when they get infected with these different viruses. And so for all of those reasons, number one, we were glad to not see any cases of myocarditis in the clinical trials, and there are some pretty good reasons we think that's the case, and it'll be lower risk in these children. Of course, we will continue to monitor with the CDC, the FDA are continuing to monitor for any of these rare side effects in the younger age groups as well.
Dr. Cohen, in your fireside chat that you had last night, one thing you mentioned was that it's still much better to not have COVID at all than have COVID. Can you talk about the risk of a long-haul COVID? So if hospitalizations are low and death is also very, very low that risk. What is the risk of a long-haul COVID case, and how prevalent is that in children?
Yeah, so I'll start, and I'll want Dr. Wong to weigh in as well. But what we are seeing, I think we are only at the beginning of understanding what the long-term impacts of having COVID are. Even for those who have a mild COVID illness, we are seeing that children can have longer-term side effects: fatigue, headache, muscle aches, lethargy, again, different kinds of tiredness. So we are seeing that in children and adults. And so I think what we want to do is say, well, look, we have a tool here that is safe and effective at preventing your child from getting COVID in the first place. Let's use that safe and effective tool to make sure they don't get COVID. I think we are still learning to understand, again, over time, how long is long COVID and how long will it last. So let me turn over to Dr. Wong.
Yeah, you know, when my patients and my parents ask me this question, the way I respond is, it's a known unknown. Because we, like Dr. Cohn was saying, we're still really learning a lot about it. I will say the patients who I know who have gotten long COVID-19, really debilitating, really scary for the family. I have some patients who say, like, you know, they have a brain fog. The way that they think just isn't normal, and it can last for so long. The other thing that's quite scary with it is that we don't yet know what the best ways to treat it are. And again, these are the types of symptoms that really impact what our children can do on a daily basis. Can they go to school or not? Can they play with their friends? Are they performing at school the way that they used to because they have this long COVID? The same way that we're seeing in adults as well. Again, these can be really debilitating symptoms that can last for a really long time. And it's scary because it's a known unknown, whereas we have a known, safe, and effective vaccine, which we know can prevent COVID, mild illness, long-term effects, acute, really severe illness. We have that safe and effective vaccine.
Last question, I promise. You identified 70% as the threshold, the target for adults' vaccinations. What threshold are you hoping for children in North Carolina? What percentage? And is there a marker that you want to set for, we get, let's say, this X amount of kids vaccinated, schools can start, maybe even preschools start relaxing mask requirements?
Well, we certainly want to get as many of our kids vaccinated as possible. That's why we're talking about it today, and we're doing a lot to make sure we can answer questions for parents. I want parents to know that asking questions is absolutely okay, and to get those questions answered by practicing physicians and get good information about making this decision for their family. I think when we put out the 70% numbers back in the spring, and actually now that COVID is even more contagious, I don't think we know exactly what the right number is in terms of everyone being vaccinated. We need to have a very high level of immunity amongst everyone in order to really see this COVID become something that we can live with. So we want to see a lot of folks get vaccinated so they can protect themselves, their children, and others. So that's our focus for today. Thanks. Yes, Brian.
Brian Anderson here with the AP. Had a few questions. First on the boosters for adults aged 18 to 64. Let's say you're an otherwise healthy adult, you don't have any of those CDC qualifications, but Thanksgiving's coming up, Christmas is coming up, maybe you have unvaccinated relatives or you're planning a flight or something. What would be your recommendation for these otherwise healthy adults? Should they get a booster now?
Sure. So first, I would say anyone who has gotten the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and it's been more than 2 months, no matter your age, you should be getting a booster. So if you got Johnson & Johnson, and as folks know, I did get Johnson & Johnson a number of months ago, so I did get a booster. So Johnson & Johnson, everyone should get a booster. On Pfizer and Moderna, we are saying that it is really recommended for those over 65 with underlying medical conditions and for those who may be at higher risk of COVID exposure. So I think that could either be in your work setting or in something that you're doing in your personal life. So I think that there is some opportunity for folks to assess their own risk and to know whether or not they are at higher risk for exposure to COVID and whether or not booster is right for them. And again, it has to be 6 months since you are fully vaccinated for Pfizer and Moderna.
How many North Carolinians have gotten any of the 3 available boosters?
I don't have those numbers in front of us, but we can get that to you.
And one more question on the booster. We know there's some interest in mix and match, and you said you've gotten the Moderna,
I did.
Having received the J&J. Would you recommend anyone get a Moderna because it's been proven to have the highest level of antibody resistance, it seems.
So what I would say, I think that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines operate very similarly. They use a very similar mechanism to teach your body to recognize COVID. So if you've gotten a Moderna or a Pfizer, I would probably stick with what you've gotten before. For those who got Johnson & Johnson, we do see some preliminary evidence to show that changing over to either the Moderna or Pfizer gives you a slightly stronger immune response. So that's why I chose to move over to the Moderna. But I think it's pretty equivalent. I don't think we have the precision to say if you got Moderna, go to Pfizer, or Pfizer back to Moderna. I think they're pretty equivalent. The one scenario that I said is a little different is if you got Johnson & Johnson, potentially getting either Pfizer or Moderna.
And you said 24,000 kids have gotten it from 5 to 11 so far?
That's right. So we've been vaccinating about 5 days now, and we've done about 24,000. We think there's more out there. It takes a little bit of a lag time, but about 24,000.
And with that number, that's 2 to 3% of that age cohort.
Yeah.
How concerning is it that it's so small right out of the gate? And we know soon there's going to be almost 500,000 doses available, and 24,000 seems to barely scratch the surface.
We are at the very beginning of this work. That's exactly why we're here today. It's why I'm sharing the story about my family's decision to get vaccinated over the weekend. You know, it was just authorized, a few days ago, and so we are still, expanding our operations. Parents have to think about, making time for it, and I think it's a great conversation to have around the dinner table this week, and then plan in the next week or so to make an appointment, go visit one of these family vaccination sites. Go to myspot.nc.gov, find a location near you. Some have appointments, some have walk-ins.
Your department had a report that came out recently looking at the effectiveness of incentives, and it seemed that there was a signal that the $4.5 million total lottery package might not have been as effective as these $25 small perks. Are there any incentives, carrots, or sticks forthcoming with boosters, kids vaccinated, any vaccination efforts?
So, well, one, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Wong, who is very involved in writing the paper about the incentives, particularly those smaller dollar incentives, the $25, $50, $100 incentives, and why they were effective. And so we are looking at ways to replicate that we saw in our adult population. What would we be thinking about for our children population? So I'll turn it over to Dr. Wong to talk about those. But yes, we are looking at that right now.
I think as Dr. Cohen has described, many times, it's all about using multiple strategies, right? We want to get as many North Carolinians, kids, teens, adults vaccinated. The paper that you're referencing, I think, is the one where we were studying the impact of our summer cards, our guaranteed small financial incentives, where we were really pleased to see that they did have an impact on reducing the rate. This was over the summer when our rates of vaccination were declining. And in the sites where we were offering those cards, particularly early on, which is when we did the study, we saw that it really slowed by like half the decline in the rate of those vaccinations, which was wonderful. Even better in many ways, we also were able to do surveys and partnering with our with colleagues at the North Carolina Central University. And what they were able to show in the surveys we were doing is that, in particular, it seemed to promote access and cover the cost of vaccination, like transportation or childcare or lost wages, particularly for some of our historically marginalized populations, so folks who are low income, Black, Latinx. And so we were really pleased to see that. We are continuing to study the impact of some of the other incentive programs. And then I'll just add, certainly those were incentive programs that we in the department were sponsoring and running. We have seen so many of our vaccine providers partnering up with businesses and foundations and just individual citizens, really creative opportunities to offer lots of different types of incentives, some that are going to appeal to different groups, right? We have some incentives for free tickets to an amusement park. We had one vaccine provider who had a car donated, and they raffled off a car, right? So I think, one incentive is not going to work for everyone, and one strategy is not going to work for everyone, so it's about putting them all together.
Follow up for you on that one. Was there a single person you're aware of who got the vaccine because of the $1 million lottery? It seems there's evidence that lots of people got the vaccine because of the $25 cash card, or at least went to those locations. But is there any evidence that a single person in North Carolina got the vaccine because of the larger lottery?
I think certainly anecdotally we've heard from folks that, that was certainly a big motivating factor, just that extra nudge that they needed, extra motivation that they needed. And again, we're still continuing to study the impact of that particular larger incentive.
And last one for Dr. Cohen. This is off of what Jonah said, just sort of about the messaging to parents for the 97% of parents plus who have not had their kids vaccinated yet. You said now's an okay time to be asking questions at the start of it. What's your message to parents who got the vaccine themselves and say, I'm willing to take a chance with me, my husband, and try a new vaccine, but it's too soon to do it for my kids?
Well, I want to make sure that folks can get their questions answered. What I would say is call your pediatrician. And all I can share is what I would do for my family, which is exactly why we shared the PSA we did today. So as a mom, as a physician, and the leader of our health and response work in COVID, I got my kids vaccinated within a couple days of this vaccine being available. And I think that's I'm not just talking the talk, we're walking the walk in our family because it's so important to protect our kids. I want the best for them. I want them to be healthy and safe. And so I hope with other families seeing what we are doing for our family, that will give them more comfort to say we can take that step forward. But I would say, of course, ask questions, call your pediatrician, and find an access point soon.
Any Lucette Grace desserts for the kids?
No, but they did get some chocolate milk after getting vaccinated. All right, I think we're going to go to some questions on the phone.
Our first question is from Richard Craver with the Winston-Salem Journal.